During the project expense overview, we'll take a look at the different ways that you can book expenses to a project, and we'll also talk about some of the essential information that you have to have on expenses. Okay, so first we'll take a look at the ways that you can record project expenses to a project. And I classified these as two different ways, primary and secondary. So the primary ways that you'll typically use to log project expenses are through an expense report. So there's integration from the expense management module to project accounting module or project management and accounting module. So expense report is one way. AP invoice journal is a pretty common way, or a very common way, I should say. So if you receive an invoice and you just want to code it to a project, it will show up on the project as an expense. And then project expense journal is another common way, and we've already talked about that in one of our previous courses. So secondary ways that you see but not as often are AP invoice. So basically AP invoice is the invoice that's used with purchase order, or you can create a AP invoice that is not necessarily associated with a purchase order, and you can add service items or procurement categories. When you add procurement categories to an AP invoice, you can actually code them to a project, and you can select whatever category you want, whether it's of item type or expense type. So if you pick expense, that's the way that you can book project expenses through an AP invoice. General journal is another way. It's very similar to the project expense journal, where you can go in there, define what your primary account offset then is the project, and then once you post that, it will be an expense on your project. And then invoice register, just another way to create an AP invoice. So those are the 6 ways. The primary ways are the ways that I commonly have implemented and seen more of through support tickets or just questions in general. And the secondary ways are the other ways that you can log project transactions. So this slide's titled Expense Transaction Essentials, and the idea is that we're just going to discuss the information that is needed on an expense type transaction. So you can see the first bullet is when, and that's basically the date. So you have to tell the system when you're recording the transaction. Then where, and that would be the project field. So with every expense transaction that you want to book to a project, you have to have a project ID. Who, you always have the availability of entering an employee or a resource or whatever the field is on your expense transaction. It's where you put your employee number that's associated with the expense, and it can be optional or mandatory. You can actually configure that. And then how much, you always have to define a quantity in your cost or your cost price or both. And then there's the invoicing information, which comes down to the sales price and the sales currency. And then there's always tax information as well. And then finally, with some of the expense reports, you have to define what the ledger accounts are. And I shouldn't say the expense reports, the expense transactions. So like a project expense journal, you have to define the offset account. So the first account's project, the offset account you get to define manually. So you have to make sure you're defining your ledger accounts appropriately, or have your posting profile set up accordingly. All right, so that's the information that's generically needed by a project expense transaction.